They all stood staring at the man on the floor. Jessica took an involuntary step backward. Charlie was glued to the spot. She could not look away from him, because I am one of them, as if he could tell what she was thinking. John stepped up beside her. Charlie, he's insane, he said quietly, and it was enough to break her away from that dreadful, sarcastic gaze. She turned to John. We have to get out, she said. He nodded, turned back to the group, and gestured to the walkie-talkie in his hand. I'm going back to the control room, he said. These things are police radios. There has to be a way to get them to reach outside. Maybe I can use the equipment in there to get a signal somehow. I'll go with you, Charlie said instantly, but he shook his head. You have to stay with them, he said, barely audible. Charlie looked over at Jessica and Carlton. He was right. Carlton needed someone with him, and Jessica was holding them together, but she couldn't be left alone in charge of the safety of both of them. Charlie nodded. Be careful, she said. He didn't answer. Instead, he tucked the walkie-talkie into his belt, gave her a wink, and left. Clay Burke was in his office, reviewing the week's case files. There was not much: traffic violations, two petty thefts, and one confession to the murder of Abraham Lincoln. Clay shuffled through the papers and sighed. Shaking his head, he opened the bottom drawer of his desk and removed the file that had been plaguing him all morning. Freddy's. When he closed his eyes, he was there again. A cheerful family restaurant, its floor streaked with blood. After Michael disappeared, he had worked 14-hour days, sometimes sleeping in the station. Every time he came home, he went to look at Carlton. He was usually asleep. He wanted to grab his son and hold him close, never let him go. It could have been any of the children there that day. It was blind, dumb luck that the killer had spared his own. At the time, it was the first murder the department had dealt with. It was a 16-person department, usually charged with small thefts and noise complaints, and to be handed a gruesome murder made all of them feel a little like kids whose toy guns had suddenly turned real. Clay opened the file, knowing what he would find. It was only a partial report. The rest of it was in a storage room in the basement. He scanned the familiar words, the bureaucratic language that tried to but failed to obscure the point. There had to be no justice done. Sometimes the guilty get away with terrible things, but it is the price we pay. He said that to Charlie. He cringed a little, now realizing how that must have sounded to her of all people. He picked up the phone, calling the front desk in a moment of urgency rather than walking it the 20 feet to ask a person. Has Dawn reported back from Freddy's? He asked from the officer on the other end who could speak. No, sir, she said. He hung up, no waiting for her to finish. Clay stared restlessly at the wall for a long moment, then grabbed his coffee cup and headed to the basement. He didn't have to search for the box of evidence from the Freddy's disappearance. He had been there before. There was no one around, and so instead of taking it upstairs to his office, Clay sat down on the concrete floor, spreading papers and photographs around him. There were interviews, witness statements, and reports from the on-scene officers, Clay included. He sifted through them aimlessly. He didn't know what he was looking for. There was nothing new here. There was nothing to find, really. They knew who did it. At first, he had suspected Henry, just like so many others around town. It was a terrible thought, but it was a terrible crime. There was no solution that would be shocking. He had not been the one to question Charlie's father, but he had read the transcript. The man had been almost incoherent, so shaken that he could not give straight answers. He sounded as if he were lying, and to most people that was proof enough. But Clay had resisted, had delayed having him arrested, and sure enough, they came to William Afton, Henry's partner. Afton seemed like the normal one in the venture, the businessman. Henry was the artist. He always seemed to be off in another world, some part of his mind thinking about his mechanical creatures, even when he was holding a conversation about the weather or the kids' soccer games. There was something off about Henry, something almost shell shocked. It seemed like a miracle that he could have produced a child as apparently normal as Charlie. Clay remembered when Henry had moved to town and began construction of the new restaurant. Someone had told him that Henry had a kid who had been abducted several years prior, but he didn't know much else. He seemed like a nice enough guy, though he was obviously terribly alone, his grief visible even at a distance. Then Faye Fazbear's opened and the town came alive. That was also when Charlie appeared. Clay didn't know Henry had a daughter until that day. William Afton was the only one who made Freddy's a business, as he had the previous restaurant. Afton was as robust and lively as Henry was withdrawn and shadowy. He was a hefty man who had the righty gentility of a financial strict Santa Claus, and he had killed the children. Clay knew it. The whole department knew it. He had been a prisoner for each abduction, and he had mysteriously and briefly vanished at the same time as each child went missing. A search of his house and found a room crammed with boxes of mechanical parts and musty yellow rabbit suit, as well as stacks of journals full of raving paranoia. Passages about Henry that rang from wild jealousy to near worship. But there have been no evidence, there have been no bodies, and there could be no charge. William Afton had left town and there was nothing to stop him. They did not even know where he had gone. Clay picked up a picture from the pile. It had been taken, framed from the wall of Henry's office at the restaurant. There's a picture of the two of them together, Henry and William, grinning into the camera in front of the newly opened Freddy Fazbear's. He stared at it. He had stared at it before. Henry's eyes did not quite match his smile. The expression looked forced, but then it always did. There was nothing unusual here, except that one of the men that turned out to be a killer. Suddenly, Clay felt a shock of recognition. Something indistinct he did not quite catch. He closed his eyes, letting his mind wander like a dog off the lead. Go on, find it. There was something about William, something familiar, something recent. Clay's eyes snapped open. He shoved everything back into the evidence box, cramming it and messingly, keeping out only the photograph, clutching it. He took the stairs up two at a time, almost running by the time he got to the main floor of the station. He headed straight for a particular filing cabinet, ignoring the greens of his startled officers. He tore open the drawer, pawing through it until there it was. Employee background checks requested by a business from last 6 months. He pulled out the stack and flipped through it, looking for photos. In the third folder, he found it. He picked up the picture and held it up to the next one of Henry and William, turning it so his body did not block the light. It's him. The background check application was labeled Dave Miller, but it was unmistakably William Afton. Afton had been fat and affable. The man in the picture was sallow and thin, his skin sagging and his expression unpleasant, as if he had forgotten how to smile. He looked like a poor, fascist smile of himself, or maybe Clay thought. He looked like he had dropped his disguise. Clay flipped the page back to see why the check had been requested, and his face drained white. His breathing stopped for a moment. Clay stood, rubbing his jacket in the same motion, then stopped. Slowly he sat, letting the jacket fall from his fingers. He took the partial file back out of its drawer and delicately he lifted one of the photos out. It had been taken in the aftermath. When the place was no more than a crime scene, he paused for a moment and closed his eyes. Then he looked again at the picture, willing himself to see it for the first time. There was a glimmer of light he had never noticed before. One of the animatronics on the stage, the bear, Freddy, was looking toward the cameraman, one of his eyes illuminated with a smear of light. Clay put the picture aside, moving to the next one. This one was from a different angle, but the side of the main stage was still in the frame. Chica's body was facing away from the camera, but her face was turned directly toward it, and another smear of light streaked across her left eye. Clay rubbed it with the tip of his finger, making sure it wasn't a defect in the paper. The next photo showed Bunny in the darkness behind the chairs. A pinpoint of light like a star shone from his eyes as though reflecting a spotlight that wasn't there. What is this? Clay could feel his face flash. He realized that he hadn't been breathing. He shuffled his hands on the desk like a conjurer, calling forth a picture to reveal itself. One did. The last picture had been taken in Pirates Cove. Tables had been disturbed, he remembered. The scene was chaotic, the tables and chairs in disarray, clutter strewn through the halls, but unlike so many other times, he had stared at his picture. He ignored the disorder and focused only on the stage. The curtain was pulled back slightly. A figure barely visible in the recess behind it, one eye presumably illuminated in a flash of a camera. Clay studied the rest of the pictures, looking for more reflections, but found none. There was no flash. Jason opened his eyes. His leg hurt. It was steady, dull pain. He flexed it tentatively and found he could move easily. The injury could not have been too bad. He was laying on something lumpy, and his whole body felt stiff, like he had been asleep on a pile he looked at what he was laying on, a pile of extension cords and wires. He sat up. It was dark, but he could dimly see what was around him. He bent over to examine his leg. His jeans were ripped where Fox's claw had gouged him, and the gash in his leg was ugly, but it was not bleeding badly. The hook had mostly got a hold of his jeans. Jason felt a little relief. Satisfied, he began to examine his surroundings. He was in a corner, and there was a heavy black curtain strung from one wall to the other, cutting the space off from the room outside. He crawled forward over the cables cautiously, careful to make no sound. He was he made his way to the edge of the curtain, where there was a tiny sliver of gap between it and the wall. Jason took a moment to steel himself, then peeked out, conscious of his every movement. He was on the small stage on Pirates Cove, behind the curtain. He could hear something moving out there, something large, but from his position, he could only see an empty room. He pushed his head out a little farther, craning his neck to look. He couldn't tell where the sound was coming from, but with each sound, he grew bolder, readying himself to leap from the stage and run. A light was pulsing in the main dining room, illuminating the hall for brief seconds at a time with bright, dizzying carnival colors. It wasn't much, but it gave Jason a direction to run. He watched it intently until it was all he could see, and then it stopped. The room was dark, darker than it had been before. His eyes had adjusted to the light, and now he was nearly blind. The shuffling sound went on, and Jason pulled the curtain open further. This time he moved too fast, and as the curtain was drawn, the metal rings that held it clanked together. The light above Pirate's Cove went on. Fox was there right in front of him. His face was so close to Jason's that they could almost touch. Jason scrambled back through the curtain, pulling it close again, trying to escape the small clove, but there was nowhere to run. He crawled backward, staying against the wall, hoping that the curtain would somehow shield him from Foxy. At once, the curtain began to open, not by force, but as if a show were to begin. Lights and color flashed in silent patterns, and the glittering front curtains rolled back in grand fashion to reveal the stage, with the beast standing patiently at its base. Foxy cocked his head to the side of it, considering something, and then he began his approach. He climbed the stairs to the stage one by one, each step a whole series of disjointed movements. as if each piece of his metal body maneuvering itself individually. Jason watched, struck with horror, yet some small part of him was enthralled. It was like nothing he had ever seen. Foxy reached the stage and took two more large, deliberate steps until he was standing over Jason. Jason stared up at him, too afraid to move, frozen in place, like a mouse beneath a diving falcon. His breath was shallow. His heart beat so fast his chest hurt. Foxy raised his hook again, and Jason threw himself down onto the floor in a ball, protecting his head with his arms, waiting for the blow to come. It did not come. Jason did not move. He waited and waited, wondering if time had slowed down as if he approached the moment of his death. His mind trying to give him refuge, making the last moments feel as long as possible, but not this long. He opened his eyes and turned his head a little, keeping his arms in front of his face. Foxy was still there, not moving. Despite himself, Jason met the creature's eyes. It was like looking into the sun. Foxy's burning gaze made Jason's eyes tear up, made him want to look away, but he could not. It was the animatronic who looked away. As Jason watched, peering through the afterburn that clouded his vision, Foxy turned to face his absent audience. His hook fell slowly to his side, his head tilted forward, and he went motionless. The sounds of whirring machinery and clicking parts came to a stop, and the curtains drew closed again. Ready? Lamar said. Marla nodded curtly. I'm ready, she said. She threw open the door, fists clenched, and they climbed out, facing opposite directions, preparing for an assault. Marla was breathing heavily, her face furious. The darkness was thick, almost tangible, and she could barely make out what was around her. She could see Lamar, but if they drifted 3 feet apart, they could be lost to each other. The lights above them flickered, but only for a moment. The brief illumination ruined what little night vision they had, making the dark impenetrable. Anything on your side? Marla whispered. Lamar looked toward her face, distressed. No, anything on your side? Light, please. Marla whispered. Lamar held up the flashlight as though aiming a weapon and turned it on. Above them, the light sputtered. Jason could see the flashlight waving back and forth, filtering through the slightly transparent curtain. Oh no! The light fell on the animatronic just for a moment, and there was a clicking noise. Jason looked up. Foxy was not moving. The light swept across him again and again. The mechanical sounds came, this time unmistakable. Though he still did not move, Jason scooted forward around Foxy's foot and looked up at the animatronic's face as the light struck him again. Again, the clucking noise came. Something inside him was radiating itself, but his eyes stayed dark. Jason crawled as forward as he was willing to venture, trying not to cross onto Fox's line of sight. He made it to the edge of the current and reached his arm out to wave a warning. Jason! He heard his sister's voice and then a quick shushing from what must have been Lamar. The flashlight swept up, turning on the stage, and Fox's eyes lit up. His head swooped toward the light with a predatory precision, and Jason, panicked, reached for the pile of cords and grabbed the cable. Foxy lifted a foot and Jason threw the cord around it and yanked it with all his strength. Foxy pitched forward, grabbing at the curtain with his hook. It caught, ensnaring him, and he ripped through the cloth with a vicious, tearing sound. Falling to the ground with a tangle of cloth and metal limbs, Jason scrambled past the struggling creature and ran toward the light. Mother reached for him, but he pushed her aside. Run, he panted, and the three of them took off down the hall. They turned a corner, and as one they stopped. Jason skidding against Lamar and grabbing him for support. And at the end of the dark hall stood another figure, too large to be a person. The top hat was unmistakable. Freddy Fazbear. His eyes were illuminating, their piercing red glow consuming the space around them. They could hear the brittle notes of a song, mechanical and thin like a music box, coming from Freddy's direction. They stared and mesmerized. Then Jason found himself and pulled at Marla's arm. Come on, he hissed, and they followed him, running back the way they had come. When they reached Park's Cliff, they slowed. Foxy had thrown off the curtain and was beginning to right himself. The three exchanged glances, then ran past him. Jason held his breath until they were through to the next doorway, invoking some old superstition. Lamar motioned to one of the party rooms, and they ducked inside. He switched off the flashlight, and they stood still for a moment, their eyes adjusting. The room had three long cafeteria-style tables. Each one is still set for a party. Metal floating chairs were lined up all up and down them, and each place was set with a party hat, a paper plate, and a plastic cup. By wordless agreement, each hid beneath a different table, leaving themselves as much space as possible. They crouched low, hoping to be lost behind the chair legs, and together they stared silently into the vacant hall and listened. Hello, anyone? John repeated into the radio, but there was only static. He had managed to hook the walkie-talkie into the sound system, but getting a signal to the outside seemed impossible. Freddy was sealed from the world. He looked at the monitors again. On one screen, he could see three fingers crouched under tables. Marla, Lamar, and Jason, he thought. They found Jason. He realized with profound relief, letting go of tension he had not known it he felt. Everything on the screen was lit with unnatural grays and whites. These must be night vision cameras, he said to no one, squinting to see through the static. He watched the blurry figures crawl and come to a stop beneath the long party tables. Then a movement from another screen caught his eye. There was a figure in the hallway, moving steadily toward the room they were in. John could not tell what it was, but the way it moved wasn't human. It stopped beside a doorway, and with a sudden jolt of realization, John looked again at the party room where his friends were hiding. He grabbed the walkie-talkie and flipped the speaker system on, jamming the volume control as high as it could go. Lamar, he said calmly, trying to sound commanding. He heard the reverberation of his own voice through the walls of the control room. Lamar, don't move. John's voice blared over the speaker, blurred with static but ineligible. Lamar, don't move. Lamar, Marla, and Jason looked at one another across the distance between the tables. The room lit up with a burning red glow, and they watched. As still as they can be, as Freddy Fazbear entered the room, his movements were mechanical and graceless as he walked with deliberate steps in the middle of the room and stopped between two tables. Mala on one side, Jason on the other. Jason looked at his sister and she put a finger to her lips. Jason hadn't realized that there were tears on his cheeks until now. He watched as Freddy surveyed the room, his head with eyes like spotlights. Worked to one side, stopped with a click, and then turned to the other side. There was a long pause. The two padded feet were motionless. The legs like trees in a forest. There was a sound of twisting fur and crackling fabric, and the feet began to pivot. Freddy turned around and headed for the door, each step shaking the floor beneath them. As Freddy passed by, Jason shrank back instantly, his foot hitting one of the metal chairs. It made a scraping sound. Jason's heart raced. Frantic, he looked across the space at Marla, who beckoned him urgently. Freddy had stopped, but they could still hear the sound of fabric and fur scrunching and moving. Freddy began to bend down. His motions were slow. And in those precious few seconds, Jason pulled the two chairs in front of him apart, making a gap just wide enough for him to be able to crawl beneath Freddy as soon as he had the chance. The light of Freddy's eyes came into view under the table, illuminating the space beside Jason, and he quickly but quietly crawled beneath the chairs to where Marla was hiding. Freddy stood again, training his eyes on the floor just as Jason pulled his foot out of sight. Freddy began to pivot toward the table they were under. Marla put a hand on Jason's arm, steadying him. There was another pause. Lamar honored the table opposite them, beckoning to Marla and Jason, urging them to his own table, further away from Freddie. Marla shook her head, not wanting to make risking a noise.